All right, let's dive right into an explainer on one of the absolute most massive demographic shifts in modern human history. We're looking at a period that completely re-engineered the global map, driven by the twin engines of industrialization and imperialism. If you've ever wondered why certain communities exist exactly where they do today, well, the answers are largely rooted right here.
Just to set the scale here, between 1815 and 1914, an estimated 50 to 55 million people migrated across oceanic distances. Think about that number for a second. This represented the absolute largest population movement in human history up to that point. It wasn't just some gradual shift, it was an unprecedented flood of humanity crossing the globe.
To make sense of all this, we're going to break this complex reorganization into 5 key pillars. 1, a world in motion. 2, European push and pull. 3, the indentured labor crisis. 4, a new system of slavery. And finally, 5, the legacies of diasporas.
We begin our journey with Section 1, a world in motion.
You see, this massive movement wasn't just a single event. It was actually 3 overlapping streams happening simultaneously. We had European mass immigration to the Americas and Australasia, the coerced Indian and Chinese indentured labor, and major internal displacements due to land seizures and forced labor. Ranging from completely voluntary to deeply coerced, all of these streams were ultimately driven by the exact same underlying process, a massive global reorganization of labor to feed industrializing empires.
Now let's move to Section 2, European push and pull.
So why did a staggering 30 million of those 50 million Europeans head to the United States alone? Well, to understand that, we have to look at the mechanics of migration. We need to examine both the push factors, those harsh conditions literally driving people out of their homes, and the pull factors, which are the golden opportunities drawing them toward their new destinations.
It's a stark contrast, really. On the push side, you had unspeakable tragedies like Ireland's Great Famine, which killed roughly 1 million people and forced another million to flee in just 5 years. Add to that rural poverty and severe political persecution, like the violent pogroms against Jewish communities in the Russian Empire starting in 1881. But then, look at the pull side. The Americas and Australasia offered cheap or even free land, plus a massive demand for industrial labor. And to top it off, new, faster steamships were pulling people in by making the journey vastly easier. We're talking about cutting a grueling 6-week crossing under sail down to just 1 week by 1900. A real game changer.
And these millions of arrivals completely transformed their new homes. Immigrant labor literally built American railways and steelworks. Irish immigrants formed the backbone of police forces in Boston and New York, while Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe practically revolutionized New York's garment industry. But these huge demographic shifts also sparked intense cultural anxieties. This tension between the economic demand for cheap labor and cultural anxiety birthed severe nativist backlashes, leading to restrictive, targeted laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
Moving right along to Section 3, the indentured labor crisis.
Throughout the 19th century, the formal abolition of the Atlantic slave trade and eventually slavery itself rolled across the globe. Britain abolished the trade in 1807 and slavery in its empire by 1833. The U.S. followed in 1865 and Brazil in 1888. It was a massive moral victory. But interestingly, this left plantation agriculture in the Caribbean, the Pacific, and parts of Africa facing a severe labor crisis. Formerly enslaved people understandably and quite rightfully refused to return to the fields to perform wage labor under conditions that still looked an awful lot like their former bondage.
So, to fill this sudden massive gap, planters and colonial governments cooked up a new solution, indentured servitude. This was a labor system relying heavily on workers from rural India and southern China. These workers would sign legally binding contracts, the indentures, agreeing to work for a fixed period, usually 5 years. In exchange, they were promised passage, food, housing, and a wage.
The sheer numbers here are pretty mind-boggling. Between the 1830s and 1917, roughly 1.75 million individuals signed these contracts. We're looking at about 1.5 million Indian workers and 250,000 Chinese workers dispersing across the globe to places like Fiji, Natal, Mauritius, Malaya, and the Caribbean.
But as you might guess, expectation rarely matched reality. As harrowing testimony from the British government's 1909 Sanderson Committee revealed, recruiting agents, known as architists, frequently misrepresented the conditions. Workers were sold on the promise of good wages in a pleasant country full of opportunity,
What they actually found was brutal, sunrise-to-sunset plantation work, wages that barely kept them alive, housing in harsh barracks scarcely better than slave quarters, and strict criminal penalties if they broke their contracts.
And this brings us to the absolutely crucial point, the trap built into the whole system. Sure, the contract technically promised freedom after 5 years, but the systemic poverty wages meant most workers couldn't possibly afford to buy a ticket home once their time was up. The grim reality was that this system resulted in the permanent, effectively forced relocation of millions.
Which naturally brings us to Section 4, a new system of slavery. Some historians, notably Hugh Tinker, don't mince words here. They argue quite directly that it was simply, quote, a new system of slavery. They point out that the extreme vulnerability of the workers and the brutal coercive mechanisms used to enforce the contracts really just rebranded unfree labor for a post-abolition world.
To look at this historical debate impartially, we really have to weigh the continuities against the changes. On one hand, you absolutely have the continuities of unfree labor, coercive enforcement, horrific living conditions, and very limited legal recourse for abuse. But on the other hand, there were technical changes. Indentured workers did technically possess legal rights, even if they were poorly enforced. Their status was theoretically time-limited, and the colonial geographies of where this labor was moving had completely shifted.
Finally, let's zoom back out for Section 5, the legacy of diasporas.
Whether they were pushed out of Europe by famine or coerced out of Asia by predatory contracts, these migrants formed diasporas. By definition, that's a community of people living outside their ancestral homeland while still maintaining cultural, linguistic, religious, or political ties to it. They had to negotiate a brand new identity between their culture of origin and their new destination.
And here's the thing. Far from being passive victims of history, these groups became incredibly powerful global political actors. For example, Irish Americans actively funded the Fenian Brotherhood and the Easter Rising back home. Over in South Africa, a young Mohandas Gandhi actually began his political career fighting for the rights of the Indian indentured community there. Meanwhile, Chinese diaspora networks provided vital financial backing for Sun Yat-sen's Republican movement. They ultimately used their transnational networks to challenge the very empires that had moved them in the first place.
So what we're ultimately looking at is a profoundly impactful social and economic phenomenon. Economically, these migrants supplied the raw muscle for booming industries and plantations worldwide. Socially, they created brand new cultural hybridities. In scale, this era fundamentally re-engineered the global demographic map in a way comparable only to the Atlantic slave trade of the preceding centuries.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. When you look around at our modern world today, our borders, our vibrant cultures, our complex politics, how much of it is still actively, undeniably defined by this awe-inspiring period of global human motion? Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating slice of history with us.